What's up, squad? This is Brandon from the band Tucson. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, I wanted to dive into one of the interesting aspects of this whole Venezuela situation. And of course, it involves a country that I think is very interesting, and that is Cuba. And why do I think Cuba is interesting? Because it's a country only 90 miles off the coast of the United States, which have some of the most vitriolic, or you can say, many people would say, aggressive or antagonistic language about the United States. Cuba has kind of been the stalwart of the whole left side of the argument of communism, socialism aspect in the global world, especially without the Soviet Union around anymore. And Cuba has been one of the major leftist drivers in the world, espousing the benefits of a socialist society or a communist leaning society, therefore. And it's also a holdover from the Cold War, sort of speak, and it's been able to do this in a very relatively stable country. The leadership and the regime on in Cuba has really not changed, and I can't think of any time that Cuba was any real threat to the so-called American empire, or the American empire meant any real harm to Cuba. Even when you look at a situation such as Guantanamo Bay, a bastion of imperialism, it found its home on Cuba for the United States, which went around taking people, sequestering them without a trial. This happened in Cuba. So the Cubans didn't try to force this base off their land, or nothing to any significant degree. So the ability to Cuba to operate antithetical or in contradiction to the United States so peacefully over such a long period of time, where they benefit that Nicolas Maduro didn't have, being 1,000 miles away, I found that to be very interesting about Cuba. And there's definitely some times in history where I can cite that Cubans actually directly benefited the United States. So I find that whole situation a little bit interesting. And what I do find even more interesting is that in the country that United States just went and in a split second deposed their leader and took him to the United States for to stand trial. The Cuban infrastructure is all, or the Cuban fingerprints are all on the halls of power inside of Venezuela. So to really get into this subject, you really got to go back to 1999 with the election of Hugo Chavez. So President Hugo Chavez in Venezuela did try to take power outside of democratic means through a coup in 92, but that coup failed. And he went back to get democratically elected in 1999. And I really like to lean on timelines when I'm looking at history and really trying to ascertain what's going on. So much media spewing propaganda and trying to spin narratives. It's really important. The only real true metric is cause and effect, which you can basically derive from the timeline. What take precedent? Hugo Chavez gets elected in 99. In 2002, there's a coup by the elites and some military officers within inside Venezuela against Hugo Chavez, where he was captured for 48 hours. Now, Chavez had enough strength amongst the supporters on the streets as well as within the military ranks to basically put this coup down. But obviously, this is something that will make him, a former coup plotter himself, very nervous. And this really helps form the bond between him and Fidel Castro, the president of Cuba. And it's no far stretch of the imagination. Why? Fidel Castro had been a great espouser of the welfare state, claim of all of the free benefits that his citizens received through education and medication, a lot of things that Hugo Chavez himself wanted to implement with inside of Venezuela. On top of that, Hugo Chavez had lived defiantly in the face of the United States for decades. His regime has survived for decades. And of course, Chavez is going to be a person that wants his regime to have longevity. He would find that very, very appealing to him. So this bond grew, and it was a sort of a relationship an oil for services bond. And this was really a savior to Cuba at the time because they had already lost their prior benefactor, the Soviet Union, when they collapsed in 91. Cuba being an island, their major goods being produced is tropical goods, primarily fruits and sugar, but no real energy, especially when it comes to oil. They are oil importer. And here you have Venezuela, full of oil, right next door to Cuba, and Cuba begins to give expertise to Venezuela in exchange for cheap oil in this oil for services program. And what you see is medical doctors going to Venezuela. You're seeing technical advisors going to Venezuela. So you have the medical doctors in Venezuela from Cuba, technical advisors from in Venezuela from Cuba, but you also have military and intelligence advisors as well. As this focus on internal state security grows in organizations such as the DGCIM, the Directorate for Military Counterintelligence, or the Governance Directorate for Military Counterintelligence, growing in Venezuela, which is pretty much the espionage or spying network to identify potential mutinies or rebellions arising within the military inside Venezuela. A lot of that leadership has Cuban fingerprints on them. Cuba was reviewing resumes from military officials. Cuba was welcoming high officers to Havana to train them on intelligence, on espionage. So a lot of the leadership in the military and intelligence community had close links and are highly favorable to Cuban methodologies as well as Cuba's training in leadership. So on top of that, you start to see that Cuba is the medical advisor, technical advisor, and they are increasingly becoming the Praetorian Guards of Venezuela. They are the security of leadership. Nicolas Maduro was surrounded by Cuban security in his regime. So going back to the timeline of why these things are so important, because it one begets the other. 2010, Nicolas Chavez, Hugo Chavez announces Venezuela is the world's largest, or has the world's largest oil reserve. 2011, Hugo Chavez announces that he is ill and he passes in 2013. In 2013, Nicolas Maduro assumes power, and in 2014, there is revolt in the streets in Venezuela due to high cost of living, and low employment or high unemployment. And the people are starting to rebel. Nicolas Maduro has enough goodwill in the upper echelons due to the leftover from the Chavez regime to suppress this rebellion on the streets. This doesn't go unnoticed by the United States, and it is Obama in 2015 that implements sanctions to eight high-ranking officials within the intelligence and military community. Now, this is what's interesting. Before 2015, there are no economic-wide sanctions for Venezuela. Even in 2007, 2008, when Hugo Chavez was nationalizing oil, business was as usual between Venezuela and the United States. But it's in 2015 that the United States really decided to start to step up the heat. And President Trump takes that a whole nother level with 2019, where he basically stops all American businesses from doing business with Venezuela. At this time, a third of Venezuela oil exports are going to the United States. And Venezuela has heavy crude, so it takes certain type of technical expertise to handle this, especially when it comes to refining capacity. And a lot of refineries in the Gulf along the coast of the United States are built to handle this Venezuelan oil. But when Trump cuts them off, Venezuela loses a major customer, and they are forced to seek to sell this oil to somebody else. And of course, there's not that many big players on the market, and they run to China. Well, 1 year, China received up to 80% of their oil exports. They're basically giving the oil away to get anything for it at this point. Now, while they're doing this, in coincidence, they're also losing productivity standards within inside Venezuela. So they're dropped below 1 million barrels a day. Venezuela lacked the administration, the technical skills to handle its own oil production. And through corruption and then lack of maintenance, they were actually losing oil production on a day-to-day basis. And this really brings into question of it's not a matter of if Maduro was going to fall, but when Maduro is going to fall, because this is in every country. If you can't grease the palms of the elites and the oligarchs within your country, they're going to start to rumble because the money are not getting to where it needs to go, and they're going to want you going sooner or later. So Maduro was in a real tight spot. It's kind of reminiscent of the pressure that the United States put on Japan before Japan, when America stopped the oil exports to Japan and Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Pacific ambitious to try to replace those exports of oil from the United States. Same thing was going on in Maduro. When America stopped the importation of oil, it really hurt America because this is the age of shale. America has sweet or a light crude coming from Canada to replace. America really needed the oil as much as Venezuela needed that customer. So with falling production and a loss of a major customer, Venezuela was in a tough spot. Maduro days were numbered unless he can get outside expertise. And there's very few countries in the world that has the investment and expertise to come in and help Venezuela. And the only country that could have done such a thing is a country like China or Russia to go down there and help. So you can see how Nicolas Maduro was really pushing pushing the United States into a position to capitalize on or basically benefit from his downfall. Now, of course, a lot of this comes from the Trump administration's 2019 breaking up business relationship with Venezuela. But Venezuela, as I said before in previous video, it was just too much of a low hanging fruit. The opportunity to go in, take over the country and control the world's largest oil reserve, it was just too much of an opportunity to miss. In the chance of letting a country like China come in and influence Venezuela to the degree that the Cubans did was too much of a risk for the United States as well. But nevertheless, what I found to be so interesting is that whatever was going on in Venezuela, it was only Nicolas Maduro and his wife that was whisked away. The whole infrastructure was left behind, including the vice presidents, the elites, the cabinet heads, even the Cuban infrastructure behind the intelligence community and the security community remains there. And when you look, Cuba has no influence in a country like it does in Venezuela. Like, of course, there's a large Cuban migration, Cuban community within the United States, which are economic migrants that left Cuba during the rise of Castro for economic and political opportunity. But with inside Venezuela, there are tens of thousands of Cubans connected to the support and supplementing the government of Venezuela as it is now that have been left in place by the United States. So what was so threatening about Maduro leadership that the United States didn't find threatening about Cuban infrastructure, that they left it in place? And I think this is a really interesting question that I have not seen answered. I'm looking at here answered. So we'd love to hear your insight. Please comment below as well. Like, share, subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Until next time, take care. Bantu up.